The grand library of Thornfield Manor fell silent as the servants discovered the body of Lord Edmund Carsworth stretched across the Persian rug, a small puncture wound beneath his left ear. The peculiarity of the crime, however, lay not in the method, but in what clutched his rigid fingers, a single sheet of parchment bearing only a series of musical notes and cryptic lyrics from various Christmas carols arranged in no discernible pattern. It was Christmas Eve, and the manor had been locked down since 4 o'clock that afternoon when freak blizzard isolated the property entirely. The telephone lines had come down hours earlier, cutting off all communication with the village of Ashford in the Vale. Lord Carsworth, a man of 63 years with considerable wealth and a reputation for ruthless business and dealings, had been found at 9:30 by his nephew Julian, who had come to fetch him for dinner. Inspector Blackwell arrived the following morning. Battling through snowdrifts to reach the estate, he found himself immediately perplexed. The library door had been locked from the inside, yet the key lay on the desk beside the body. The windows were sealed shut, their frost-covered panes unbroken. Most remarkably, no weapon had been discovered anywhere within the room or the manor grounds, though the method appeared almost surgical in its precision. Whoever had wielded the instrument possessed either medical knowledge or intimate familiarity with anatomy. The parchment's cryptic message deepened the mystery considerably. Musical staff lines intersected with fragments from well-known carols, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, appeared alongside Silent Night, yet the arrangement suggested something beyond mere nostalgia. The handwriting was neither Lord Carsworth's nor any servant's. The paper itself was expensive stock, yellowed with age, but bearing no date. Inspector Blackwell interviewed each member of the household with growing frustration. Julian Carsworth, the heir to the considerable estate, claimed he had been in his room reading until 7 o'clock. The household tiptoed staff provided alibis for one another, though none could account for every moment of the crucial hours between 4 and 9. Lady Carsworth, Edmund's wife, of 40 years, had been resting in her chambers due to illness, though notably she seemed neither shocked nor particularly grieved by her husband's demise. The cook and housekeeper had been occupied with Christmas preparations in the kitchen, visible to each other throughout. The locked room troubled the inspector most. The furniture bore no sign of disturbance. A glass of brandy sat half-finished on the desk, and preliminary examination suggested the poison theory, though no toxin was immediately apparent. Yet the wound contradicted everything. It was far too precise, too deliberate for a killing accomplished through poison alone. As Blackwell departed to consult with Scotland Yard, unable to telephone due to the damaged lines, a telegram was dispatched to a small Belgian gentleman residing in London. Within 48 hours, Hercule Poirot would arrive at Thornfield Manor, carrying with him nothing but a battered leather suitcase and the little grey cells that had unravelled. 100 seemingly impossible crimes. The parchment remained the chief puzzle. Its message appeared designed specifically for discovery, yet no servant could explain its origins. It suggested an intimate knowledge of both music and Lord Carsworth's movements. Most intriguingly, it implied that the killer wished their work to be not merely a murder, but a puzzle, a riddle wrapped within the festive season itself, waiting for the right detective to decode the Christmas carol code that would expose a killer moving freely among the trapped household. Hercule Poirot arrived at Thornfield Manor on the morning of the 27th of December, stepping from his motor car with the deliberate precision of a man accustomed to observation. The snow had melted considerably, revealing the gravel drive and the Sierre Manor's Gothic facades in sharp relief. Inspector Blackwell greeted him in the entrance hall, relief evident in his weathered features, though Poirot noted the subtle tension around the man's mouth, the expression of someone who had begun to doubt his own investigative prowess. The Belgian detective listened to Blackwell's account with characteristic patience, his small dark eyes occasionally narrowing as the inspector spoke. When the parchment was produced for examination, Poirot held it delicately, studying the musical notation with an intensity that seemed to penetrate far beyond the mere arrangement of notes. He did not speak for several moments, allowing his fingers to trace the edges of the aged paper, noting its slight brittleness and the faint discoloration suggesting exposure to moisture at some point in its history. "The handwriting, Poirot murmured. "It attempts disguise, no? The flourishes are too deliberate, the slopes too carefully controlled. This is the work of someone attempting to conceal their natural penmanship." He turned to Blackwell. "You have examined the hands of each suspect, I presume. The calluses, the ink stains, the peculiarities that betray profession and habit. Blackwell's silence proved answer enough. Poirot proceeded directly to the library, where the body had been photographed but not yet removed. The room itself was precisely as described, orderly, undisturbed, the locked door presenting its continuing mystery. Yet Poirot's examination diverged sharply from routine procedure. He did not immediately concern himself with the wound or the locked mechanism. Instead, he moved to these bookshelves, studying their arrangement with meticulous attention. What caught his notice was subtle. A gap in the leather-bound collection near the bottom shelf, a rectangular space where a volume had clearly been removed and not replaced. The adjacent books bore no dust, suggesting the absence was recent. Poirot knelt, examining the shelf's edge, where a faint scratch marked the wood, as though something had been dragged forcefully from its resting place. When summoned to interview Lady Harsworth in the drawing-room, Poirot observed her with eyes that missed nothing. She sat with perfect composure, her black morning dress impeccably tailored, yet her left hand bore a marked tremor as she lifted her teacup. More telling still was the faint indentation on her right ring finger, a band of paler skin where jewellery had been removed recently, within days at most. When questioned about her relationship with her husband, her response came too readily, too rehearsed, as though she had prepared these words in advance. The nephew Julian proved equally revealing. When Poirot mentioned the locked library door, a flicker of something unguarded crossed the young man's features. Not fear precisely, but a sudden awareness that his assumptions might prove incorrect. He adjusted his cufflinks with unnecessary frequency, a nervous gesture that Poirot filed away for future reference. His alibi of reading in his room had been supported by no one. He had admitted this freely, yet his manner suggested he anticipated questions he had not yet been asked. In the kitchen, Poirot engaged the elderly cook in seemingly casual conversation about Christmas preparations, yet his questions subtly probed the movements of the household. Staff during the crucial afternoon hours, the cook's responses were consistent, almost rehearsed, revealing the well-coordinated story that servants inevitably constructed when questioned about criminal matters. As evening descended upon Thornfield Manor, Poirot requested the ledgers of household accounts from the past 5 years. His little grey cells had already begun their methodical work, assembling fragments into patterns that others had failed to perceive. The Christmas Carol code remained undeciphered, but its purpose was becoming increasingly apparent, not merely a message, but a confession disguised as a puzzle. On this morning of the 28th, Poirot conducted his interviews in the small study adjacent to the library, a room he had claimed as his temporary headquarters. He began with Julian Carsworth, whose composure had visibly deteriorated overnight. The young man's fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair as Poirot settled into his seat with meticulous care, arranging his person as though comfort were a matter of supreme importance. "You were reading in your room from 7 o'clock onward," Poirot began, his tone conversational. "Yet when I inquired which book occupied your attention, you could not recall its title with any precision. Curious, non? A man reads for hours, and the book makes so little impression that its name escapes him entirely." Julian's jaw tightened. "I was distracted. Uncle Edmund's health had been deteriorating, and I was concerned about my inheritance prospects. The estate, the future of the family holdings." "Ah, the inheritance. Naturally, this preoccupies a young man whose uncle controls considerable assets. Tell me, how much was Uncle Edmund worth at the moment of his demise?" "I have no idea. His solicitors would—" "Yet you know precisely enough to calculate your improved circumstances now that he is deceased. Most curious indeed." Poirot rose and moved to the window. "You see, young Julian, I have examined the household ledgers. The accounts reveal something most illuminating. Approximately 3 months ago, substantial sums began disappearing from your uncle's private account. The amounts were carefully calculated, never large enough to trigger immediate investigation, but considerable over time. Your gambling debts, if I am not mistaken. The establishments in London are remarkably consistent in their record-keeping." Julian's face drained of colour. He began to speak, but Poirot continued without pause. "And yet you did not kill your uncle. Not because you lacked motive, you possessed that in abundance, but because you lacked knowledge of the locked room's mechanism. You did not even know, until this moment, that the victim held a secret way of securing that particular door." The interview with Lady Carsworth proved more enlightening still. She entered the study with practised elegance, her black dress trailing softly against the carpet. Poirot offered her tea, which she accepted with the steady hand that betrayed none of the tremor Poirot had observed previously. Your marriage to Lord Carsworth spanned aside 40 years, Poirot observed, a considerable investment of time and effort, and yet the household staff reports that you have occupied separate chambers for the past 18 months. A cooling of affection, perhaps? My health, Lady Carsworth began. Indeed, your health was quite conveniently ill on the afternoon of the murder. Yet the physician who attended you states that your illness was minor, requiring merely rest. You might have observed your husband during the crucial hours between 4 and 9 o'clock, yet you chose not to emerge from your chambers. Very prudent of you, if one were attempting to establish an unshakable alibi. Lady Carsworth's composure fractured momentarily, her eyes betraying something between fear and calculation. I had nothing to do with Edmund's death. Of this I am already convinced, Poirot replied, returning to his chair. However, you possess knowledge that you have thus far withheld. The indentation upon your ring finger suggests you removed a piece of jewellery recently, a wedding band perhaps, or something more significant. Your husband's behaviour toward her. You had changed substantially in recent months. He had discovered something about you, had he not? Something that threatened to expose a secret you had guarded carefully. The woman's silence was confirmation enough. Poirot noted the precise angle of her gaze, the slight trembling that had returned to her hands. She was afraid, certainly, but her fear stemmed not from the guilt of murder, but from the exposure of some other transgression. There is something that had made her willing to remain absent from the library during the crucial hours, regardless of what transpired within. The cook and housekeeper presented identical recollections of their activities, their accounts synchronized with suspicious precision, their nervous laughter at Poirot's, questions revealing the defensive camaraderie of servants protecting one another's secrets. Yet neither had committed murder. This much Poirot could discern with certainty. By the afternoon of the 28th, Poirot had established himself in the library itself, surrounded by documents, household records, and the ever-present parchment bearing its cryptic musical notation. Inspector Blackwell observed as the Belgian detective constructed a timeline upon the wall, each suspect's movements meticulously charted against the known facts. What emerged was not clarity, but rather a complex tapestry of intersecting motives, each sufficient unto itself for murder, yet none fully explaining the peculiar circumstances of the crime. Poirot summoned the household members once more, this time collectively, arranging them in the drawing-room like pieces upon a chessboard. He began his exposition with characteristic deliberation, his small frame dominating the space through sheer force of intellect rather than physical presence. We must examine first the matter of financial necessity, Poirot announced. Lord Edmund Carsworth was not merely wealthy, he was a man who guarded his wealth with pathological ferocity. Young Julian required funds in order to satisfy his gambling debts, debts that his uncle refused categorically to settle. The young man's creditors had begun to approach Lord Carsworth directly, threatening exposure. Julian possessed motive, certainly, but he lacked the sophistication to orchestrate this particular crime. His panic when confronted with the locked room's complexity betrayed his innocence in this specific act. He turned his attention to Lady Carsworth, whose composure had begun to fracture under prolonged scrutiny. For the lady of the manor, the motive extends beyond mere financial consideration. Her secret, revealed through careful inquiry with the physician and certain discreet interviews in the village, concerns a relationship of an intimate nature with a gentleman, considerably younger than herself. Her husband, upon discovering this indiscretion, threatened to divorce her and expose her to complete social ruin. The financial settlement would have been minimal, her reputation utterly destroyed. She possessed both motive and opportunity, yet she lacks the medical knowledge required to inflict such a precise wound. Her absence from the library was deliberate, a calculated alibi achieved through strategic illness. The cook shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Poirot's gaze swept across the assembled group. The kitchen staff presents a united front, their accounts synchronized with suspicious precision. Yet inquiry into their personal circumstances reveals that Lord Carsworth had recently discovered evidence of systematic theft from the household stores, items of value being sold, discreetly to supplement meagre wages. He intended to dismiss them without references, rendering them unemployable. Their motive, therefore, was preservation of livelihood. However, their knowledge up to the library's security was superficial at best. They possessed neither access nor expertise. Poirot paused, allowing silence to accumulate weight in the room. His next words fell with the deliberateness of hammer blows. There remains one individual whose motive transcends the merely financial or personal. One person whose entire existence had been shaped by Lord Carsworth's actions decades prior. One person whose presence within this household has been accepted without movements unmonitored. Their knowledge of the master's habits intimate and absolute. Inspector Blackwell leaned forward, his early gift of scepticism giving way to genuine interest. All eyes turned toward the corner of the room where the elderly gardener, Thomas Wickham, sat with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to invisibility. "Tell me," Poirot addressed him directly, "of your daughter, the one Lord Carsworth seduced and abandoned 40 years ago, resulting in her death during childbirth. Tell me of the grandson who grew up without father or grandfather, raised in poverty whilst his biological grandfather accumulated vast wealth mere miles away. Tell me of the arranged position you secured within this household 5 years ago, when your grandson had reached sufficient maturity to understand the injustice perpetrated upon his family." Wickham's weathered face remained impassive, yet something shifted within his eyes, a recognition that concealment had become futile. The motive maze suddenly collapsed into singular terrible clarity, revealing not murderous passion, but calculated vengeance spanning generations. The Christmas Carol code, Poirot realized, had been crafted by someone intimate with both music and the master's routines, someone whose presence in their manner granted access to knowledge others could never possess. Inspector Blackwell rose from his chair with the triumphant expression of a man who believed the puzzle had been solved. He gestured to the constable stationed near the door, prepared to place Thomas Wickham under arrest for the murder of Lord Edmund Carsworth. Yet Poirot's raised hand arrested the proceedings with the authority of absolute certainty. "Non, non, non," the Belgian detective said softly, his tone carrying the weight of contradiction that could not be dismissed. "You're about to commit a grave error, Inspector. Wickham possesses motive in abundance, this we have established. He possessed knowledge of the household's rhythms and the master's habits, yet he did not commit this murder." Blackwell's face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. The man had every reason to kill Carsworth. The injustice, the decades of suffering, surely you cannot deny the overwhelming motive? "Motive and guilt are not identical twins," Poirot replied, moving toward Wickham with careful deliberation. "Tell me, Thomas, the scratch upon the library shelf, you know of what I speak? The mark made when something was forcibly removed? This damage occurred within the past 48 hours, yet you have not entered that room in over 3 months. The household ledgers confirm your duties confined you to the gardens and exterior maintenance." Wickham met Poirot's gaze with an expression of profound weariness. "I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot. God knows I had reason enough, but I did not. I had made peace with my suffering long ago. My grandson insisted I come here, to bear witness to the man's existence, to remind myself why life had treated us so harshly. But murder, no, that was not my purpose." Inspector Blackwell appeared genuinely shaken. He sank back into his chair, the brief certainty of solution dissolving into renewed confusion. "Then we are back where we began. The locked room, the weapon that cannot be found, the parchment with its meaningless code. Nothing has been clarified." "On the contrary," Poirot said, returning to his position near the fireplace, "everything has been clarified, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipated. You see, Inspector, we have been approaching this investigation with the assumption that Lord Carsworth was the intended victim. This assumption, while seemingly obvious, obscures the truth entirely." A profound silence settled upon the drawing-room. Even Lady Carsworth, who had resigned herself to exposure, looked up with renewed interest. Julian ceased his nervous fidgeting, recognizing that a fundamental shift in understanding had occurred. Poirot retrieved the parchment, studying it once more with the intensity of a man reading scripture. This document was not created by the murderer, but rather by someone desperate to communicate a message under circumstances of extreme constraint. The musical notation, seemingly random, contains a pattern when one possesses the proper key. And the key, my friends, lies in understanding what Lord Carsworth discovered in the months preceding his death. He turned to address the assembled group, his dark eyes moving from face to face with surgical precision. "Someone within this household committed a crime far more sin and theft or infidelity. Someone exploited their position of trust to accumulate not merely money, but power. The power of secrets, of blackmail, of coercion. Lord Carsworth had begun to piece together the evidence. The missing book from the library shelf contained his private journal, wherein he recorded his suspicions with meticulous detail. The cook suddenly rose from her seat, her hand trembled visibly. Yet Poirot's attention remained fixed upon a different target entirely, a figure who had thus far remained silent, observing with the calculated neutrality of someone orchestrating events from behind the scenes. The household accountant, Mr. Fairfax, who had arrived to assist with the investigation and had been granted access to all areas of the manor, now found himself the object of Poirot's unwavering scrutiny. It was not Wickham who removed that volume from the Poirot stated with absolute certainty. It was you, Monsieur Fairfax, and you did so because Lord Carsworth's journal contained evidence that would expose your elaborate scheme of embezzlement spanning the past 3 years. The Christmas Carol code was not a confession. It was a cry for help, inscribed upon parchment by a man who had already begun to suspect that his death was imminent. Fairfax's composure remained intact for precisely 3 seconds before fracturing entirely. He lunged toward the window, seeking escape through the frozen gardens beyond. But Inspector Blackwell's constables moved with the coordinated efficiency of men trained for such contingencies. Within moments, the accountant found himself restrained, his desperate struggles subsiding into the hollow gasps of a man whose world had collapsed irrevocably. Yet Poirot raised his hand once more, commanding silence through sheer force of presence. There is considerably more to this matter than simple embezzlement, Inspector. The Christmas Carol code was not Lord Carsworth's creation, but rather something far more intricate, a message constructed by someone who understood both music and mathematics. Someone with access to Lord Carsworth's private study during the crucial hours between 4 and 9 o'clock. He turned his attention to the cook, whose trembling hands betrayed her involvement in the conspiracy that was now beginning to unravel. You knew, did you not? You possessed knowledge of Fairfax's embezzlement scheme, perhaps because your own son was implicated in the financial arrangements. Tell me, when did you first realise that your involvement in this household theft had extended beyond mere petty pilfering? The elderly woman's composure crumbled entirely. My boy needed money, sir. He'd made poor choices, borrowed from the but you were wrong people. Mr. Fairfax said he could arrange matters, that Lord Carsworth would never discover the small amounts we were taking. But then, she paused, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. Then Mr. Fairfax came to me 3 weeks ago and asked me to do something terrible. He wanted me to put something in the master's brandy, something to make him sleep deeply. I refused. Where I did. And yet, Poirot interjected, you did not report this attempted coercion to Lord Carsworth or to the authorities. This omission speaks volumes about the nature of your entanglement in Fairfax's schemes. You suspected, did you not, that your complicity in the theft would render your testimony worthless? The accountant, restrained by the constables, began to speak with the desperate urgency of a condemned man seeking to rewrite his fate through confession. It was only money, nothing more. Lord Carsworth was obscenely wealthy. He would never have missed the amounts I was transferred to. But then he discovered the discrepancies in the accounts. He called me into his study on Christmas Eve and informed me that he had examined every transaction meticulously. He gave me until Boxing Day to confess to the authorities voluntarily, or he would initiate criminal proceedings himself. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmation merely validated what his little grey cells had already determined, which presented you with an impossible dilemma. Prison, certainly, but also the dissolution of your reputation, the ruin of your family's prospects, and the exposure of your own son's involvement in the scheme. Lord Carsworth, despite his many flaws, possessed an inflexible moral code regarding financial dishonesty. I didn't kill him intentionally, Fairfax protested, his voice taking on the wheedling quality of desperation. I only wanted to discuss matters further, to negotiate some arrangement. When he refused to listen, when he made clear that his decision was immutable, I simply lost control for a moment. There was a letter opener on his desk, decorative, with an ivory handle carved into the shape of a Christmas angel. I took it, and when he turned away from me, dismissing me as though I were beneath the consideration, I acted without the thought, without premeditation. And the locked door? Inspector Blackwell demanded. An accident, Fairfax continued, his words tumbling forth in desperate succession. After it was done, I panicked. I used his own key to secure the door, thinking it would buy me time to fabricate some explanation. I placed the parchment in his hand because I thought if it seemed like some elaborate puzzle, some mysterious crime, perhaps suspicion would fall elsewhere. I didn't know about the Christmas carols truly. I simply chose notes at random, hoping the incomprehensibility would confound investigators. Yet something in Poirot's expression suggested that this explanation, while partially true, remained incomplete. He turned toward this constable, holding Fairfax, then toward Inspector Blackwell, and finally toward the assembled household members whose secrets had begun to unravel with precision of a carefully constructed tapestry coming undone. The Christmas Carol code had not been random at all, Poirot realised, and Fairfax's confession, while addressing the murder itself, failed entirely to explain the message that had been so deliberately placed within the victim's rigid fingers. Poirot held up his hand once more, silencing Fairfax's continued protestations of semi-accidental culpability. The Belgian detective moved toward the pianoforte that occupied the corner of the drawing room, an instrument that had remained untouched throughout the investigation. He seated himself upon the bench with deliberate ceremony, his small fingers poised above the ivory keys with the precision of a concert virtuoso. The Christmas Carol code, Poirot announced, was not composed by you, Monsieur Fairfax. This much is evident. Your knowledge of music, according to the household staff, extended now barely to humming a popular tune. Yet the parchment bears the notation of someone intimately familiar with musical composition, someone capable of encoding a message within the very structure of melody itself. He began to play, his fingers moving across the keys with unexpected facility, translating the cryptic notation from the parchment into audible reality. The melody that emerged was haunting, deliberately fragmented, yet undeniably purposeful. As the notes filled the drawing room, Poirot observed each occupant's reaction with meticulous attention. Lady Carsworth's face went deathly pale. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The cook and housekeeper exchanged glances of mutual incomprehension, but it was the young housemaid, Catherine Shaw, who had remained in the background throughout the investigation, silent, observant, unremarkable in every conventional sense, whose reaction betrayed everything. Her entire body stiffened as the melody progressed. Her hands clenched into fists so tight that her fingernails drew blood from her palms. When Poirot reached the final notes, a sound emerged from her throat that was neither speech nor song, but rather a profound expression of anguish held captive for days beyond. Endurance. You knew, Poirot said softly, ceasing his performance and turning to face the young woman. You knew precisely what that parchment contained because you saw Lord Carsworth compose it. You were present in the library during the afternoon of Christmas Eve, were you not? Not as a servant conducting routine duties, but as someone engaged in a transaction of a far more intimate nature. Catherine's composure shattered with the same finality as fragile crystal dropped upon marble. Tears streamed down her face as she attempted to speak, her words emerging in broken fragments. He said he cared for me. He said, he promised. She could not continue, her body racked with sobs that seemed to emanate from some profound place of betrayal. Inspector Blackwell rose, his expression changing from confusion to dawning comprehension. The young woman was being exploited. Carsworth used his position of authority. Precisely, Poirot confirmed, his tone carrying neither judgment nor surprise, merely the cold acknowledgement of facts. And when Lord Carsworth composed the Christmas Carol code, he was not creating a puzzle for investigators, but rather a message of apology, a confession of sorts to be discovered after his death. He had realised in the final days of his life the extent of his moral failures. The musical notation, when properly decoded, contains fragments of biblical verse, passages concerning redemption and forgiveness. He was attempting to communicate his belated recognition of his own corruption. Catherine, through her tears, nodded confirmation. He asked me to come to the library on Christmas Eve. He said he wanted to explain something to me, to make arrangements that would protect my future. He gave me the parchment and told me to memorize the melody, that it contained a message meant only for those he had wronged. He said he was going to change, that he would make restitution. But before he could enact such redemption, Poirot continued, Fairfax arrived driven by his own desperation and fear. The letter opener that punctured the victim's flesh was wielded by a man seeking to preserve his criminal enterprise, unaware that his victim had already begun the process of moral transformation. Poirot rose from the pianoforte bench and addressed the assembled group with the gravity of a confessor. You see, this crime was not merely about embezzlement or revenge or sexual exploitation, though all such elements contributed to the tragedy. It was ultimately about the collision between human weakness and the possibility of redemption, a collision that occurred too late for Lord Edmund Carswith to achieve the transformation he had begun to envision. The drawing room fell into a silence so profound that even the crackling of the fireplace seemed to intrude upon its sanctity. Inspector Blackwell began issuing orders for Fairfax's formal arrest and the documentation of Catherine's testimony, moving with the mechanical efficiency of a man grateful to have returned to procedural certainty. Yet Poirot remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the parchment that now lay upon the pianoforte's polished surface. It was this momentary distraction that proved catastrophic. The constable stationed nearest the door turned his attention towards Fairfax, who had begun to struggle anew, his voice rising in protestation against the injustice of his impending incarceration. In that instant of collective focus upon the accountant's desperate resistance, Lady Carswith rose from her chair with a fluid grace that belied her supposed infirmity. She moved toward the pianoforte with the deliberate purpose of someone acting upon a decision made long before this moment. Her hand extended toward the parchment not to examine it, but to seize it with the urgency of someone destroying evidence of catastrophic significance. Poirot's perception, honed by decades of criminal investigation, caught the movement fractionally too late. By the time he turned to intercept her, Lady Carswith had already thrust the aged document directly into the heart of the fireplace. The paper ignited with startling rapidity, his yellowed fibres consumed by flames that seemed almost eager in their consumption. The musical notation, the evidence of Lord Carswith's attempted redemption, the key to understanding his final days, disintegrated into ash and smoke within seconds. Inspector Blackwell lunged forward, but the destruction was already complete. Not a single fragment remained intact. "Why?" Poirot demanded, his voice carrying an undertone of profound disappointment. "You possessed no direct involvement in this crime. Your secret, while damaging to your reputation and financial security, did not warrant such desperate action." Lady Carswith returned to her chair with the same composed grace that had characterized her throughout the investigation. Yet her eyes now blazed with an emotion far more volatile than fear. A terrible combination of maternal protectiveness and knowledge of truth that extended beyond the boundaries of this single terrible Christmas Eve. "That parchment contained information that would have destroyed my son," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Julien is not merely a weak man addicted to gambling, Monsieur Poirot. When Edmund discovered the extent of the embezzlement scheme, he also discovered Julien's involvement in arranging the initial contact between my son and Mr. Fairfax. My boy was not an innocent victim of that man's schemes. He was an active participant, motivated by desperation and the promise of wealth." Inspector Blackwell's expression shifted once more, cycling through confusion toward a new and troubling comprehension. The parchment contained evidence implicating Julien in the conspiracy? Not merely implicating, Lady Carswith corrected, but detailing his actions with meticulous precision. Edmund had begun to suspect that Julien's involvement ran deeper than simple financial complicity. There were certain transactions, certain arrangements, that suggested my son had perhaps knowledge of Fairfax's activities extending back further than anyone has yet acknowledged. Poirot felt the delicate structure of his investigation beginning to crumble like the parchment now reduced to worthless ash. The destruction of that document was not a simple act of maternal desperation, but rather a calculated removal of evidence that would have revealed a conspiracy far more intricate than the murder itself suggested. He turned towards Julien, whose face had drained of all colour, his hands trembling with the intensity of someone whose carefully constructed facade had been irreparably breached. "You knew," Poirot said with absolute certainty. "You knew that your mother intended to destroy the parchment. You coordinated this action in advance, did you not? The glances exchanged, the subtle communications between you across the drawing room. I was too focused upon Fairfax's confession to observe the more delicate machinations occurring elsewhere." Lady Carswith smiled with the terrible serenity of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her son's dubious future. Edmund was going to expose Julien's complicity. The boy would have faced criminal prosecution, imprisonment, social ruin. I could not permit that outcome. The parchment represented the only evidence of the extent of his involvement. Without it, Edmund's journal becomes merely the incomplete musings of a dying man, circumstantial at best, legally inadmissible at worst. Poirot was contemplating his response to Lady Carsworth's revelation when the electricity suddenly failed throughout Thornfield Manor. The drawing room plunged into darkness, interrupted only by the fading firelight, casting dancing shadows across the assembled group. Inspector Blackwell called out orders for the constables to maintain their positions, yet the sudden loss of illumination had created precisely the chaos that someone had meticulously engineered. A scream pierced the darkness. Not the theatrical cry of distress, but rather the genuine expression of someone experiencing sudden, violent pain. It came from the direction of the hallway beyond the drawing room. Blackwell rushed toward the sound, his constables following with the coordinated urgency of trained officers. Poirot, however, remained momentarily frozen, his acute perception detecting something far more disturbing than simple accident or mechanical failure. The electricity had not failed naturally. Someone had deliberately severed the connection, creating the precise conditions necessary for violence to occur under cover of darkness. When the earnestly surveyed and the constables returned, with lamps hastily assembled, they discovered Thomas Wickham collapsed upon the corridor floor, blood streaming from a deep laceration across his temple. He had been struck with considerable force, a blow administered with the clear intention of causing either unconsciousness or death. "Who did this?" Inspector Blackwell demanded, his authoritative tone suggesting he believed the answer would come forth readily. Yet the hallway remained empty save for the wounded gardener and the constables who had discovered him. No weapon lay nearby. No suspect cowered in the darkness. Poirot knelt beside Wickham, examining the wound with professional detachment. The blow had been delivered with precision, targeting the vulnerable area where the temporal artery pulsed beneath the skin. An amateur would have struck haphazardly. This attack bore the hallmarks of someone possessing anatomical knowledge, the same expertise in fact that had enabled the murder of Lord Edmund Carsworth. "Where is Fairfax?" Poirot asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. The constables exchanged confused glances. The accountant had been in their custody mere moments before the electricity failed. Yet when they rushed back to the drawing room, they discovered the position where Fairfax had been restrained was now empty. The constable assigned to guard him lay unconscious near the doorway, a substantial bruise already darkening upon his skull. Inspector Blackwell's face flushed crimson with the mortification of a man whose professional competence had been publicly demonstrated as inadequate. "How is the manor is isolated, surrounded by snow and winter weather. Fairfax cannot have escaped the grounds." Yet Poirot's expression suggested he had already begun to perceive the terrible logic underlying these seemingly disconnected events. He moved swiftly through the manor's corridors, his mind assembling facts into a pattern that should have been obvious from the investigation's inception. When he arrived at the library, his worst suspicions were confirmed. The locked door stood open, its mechanism somehow circumvented. Upon the desk lay the leather-bound journal that Lord Carsworth had kept with such meticulous care, but its pages had been systematically removed and destroyed. The evidence documenting not merely Fairfax's embezzlement, but Julian's involvement, and something far more sinister that Poirot could not yet fully comprehend, had been reduced to scattered fragments. "Fairfax did not act alone," Poirot announced upon returning to the drawing room, where the household assembled in stunned confusion. This entire performance, his confession, his apparent capture, his dramatic escape, all has been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the manor's layout, its electrical systems, and Lord Carsworth's private documentation. Someone who possesses the medical knowledge required to strike Wickham with such lethal precision. Someone whose presence throughout this investigation has been so thoroughly established that suspicion could never reasonably attach to them. Poirot's gaze swept across the assembled group before settling upon Inspector Blackwell himself. "Tell me, Inspector, when precisely did you last verify Fairfax's location with your own eyes?" Blackwell's silence proved more eloquent than any verbal response could have achieved. Poirot had identified not merely the murderer, but a second criminal whose motivations extended far beyond the simple preservation of embezzled wealth. Someone was still several steps ahead, and the game, far from concluding, was merely entering its most dangerous phase. Inspector Blackwell's face drained of colour as he comprehended the implications of Poirot's observation. Yet before he could respond, Poirot raised his hand in a gesture of restraint. "Do not move, Inspector. You will remain precisely where you are Until I have completed my analysis of the circumstances that have brought us to this juncture." Poirot moved to the window, gazing out upon the snow-covered grounds of Thornfield Manor with the intensity of a man reading ancient text written in a language long thought dead. His fingers drummed a peculiar rhythm against the window pane, the same rhythm, Poirot realised with sudden clarity, that matched the musical notation from the Christmas Carol code. "The pattern," he announced ahead, turning back to address the assembled group, "has been evident since my arrival at the Hearst Manor, yet I permitted myself to be distracted by the obvious. The locked room, the embezzlement, the exploitation of young Catherine. I failed to observe what was happening directly before my eyes." He moved towards Inspector Blackwell with a deliberate purpose, his gaze never wavering from the policeman's face. "You arrived at Thornfield Manor on the morning following Lord Carsworth's death. You claimed that the telephone lines had been damaged by the storm, preventing communication with Scotland Yard. Yet the constables who accompanied you stated clearly that they had observed you speaking on the telephone not 12 hours after your arrival. Telephone conversation conducted in the private study with the door locked, using terminology that suggested you were not communicating with your superiors at all." Blackwell attempted to rise, but the constables, now uncertain of their commander's trustworthiness, moved to restrain him there. He did not struggle, instead regarding Poirot with an expression of bitter resignation. "Furthermore," Poirot continued, "you possessed knowledge of the manor's electrical system that should have been unavailable to you. When the electricity failed this evening, you reacted with the composure of someone who had anticipated such a development. You knew precisely where the circuit breaker was located, information that should have required consultation with the household staff." Catherine, who had remained silent since her emotional confession, suddenly gasped with recognition. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came to the library the evening before Lord Carsworth died. I saw you through the servants' passage. You gave Mr. Fairfax something, a small packet. I thought it was money, but it was not money," Poirot finished. "It was the letter opener that would later be employed in the commission of murder. You see, Inspector Blackwell is not merely a corrupt officer of the law. He is the architect of this entire tragedy, working in concert with Fairfax to engineer Lord Carsworth's death." Blackwell's composure finally fractured. He leaned forward, his voice emerging with desperate intensity of a man whose carefully constructed deception had been irrevocably exposed. "Edmund Carsworth ruined my brother 20 years ago. A business venture that Carsworth deliberately undermined through corrupt practices. My brother lost everything, his family, his reputation, ultimately his life when he took his own hand in desperation. I have spent 2 decades waiting for the opportunity to exact justice." "Yet justice was not your true motivation," Poirot observed coldly. "You discovered Fairfax's embezzlement scheme through your investigation into Carsworth's finances. You recognised immediately that this presented an opportunity, a way to eliminate your nemesis while providing the perfect suspect. You contacted Fairfax before arriving at the manor, offering him assistance in exchange for his cooperation in framing the murder, in such a way that the investigation would lead inexorably toward him." "I intended to catch him myself," Blackwell protested. "I was going to make the arrest, to ensure justice was served." "You intended," Poirot interrupted, "to ensure that the truth regarding Lord Carsworth's true killer would never emerge. The electricity failure, the attack upon Wickham, Fairfax's escape, these were all orchestrated to prevent careful examination of the evidence. You were systematically destroying documentation that would prove your involvement." Inspector Blackwell's silence confirmed everything. Poirot had identified not merely a criminal, but a man corrupted by decades of festering revenge, willing to pervert the very institution he served to achieve his personal vengeance. The pattern that had seemed so chaotic now revealed itself as deliberately constructed deception, with the detective himself serving as the instrument of confusion rather than clarity. Poirot settled into a chair across from Inspector Blackwell, regarding the man with an expression that blended profound disappointment with clinical interest. The constables maintained their vigilant positions, yet the tension in the drawing room had shifted from the frantic energy of active investigation into the suffocating stillness of revelation approaching its inevitable conclusion. 20 years is a considerable span of time to nurture revenge, Poirot observed, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical contemplation. Most men would have found alternative outlets for such consuming bitterness Yet you, Inspector, transformed your personal tragedy into the fuel for meticulous, decades-long planning. This suggests that the death of your brother, while genuinely motivating, was not the sole motive animating your actions. Blackwell's jaw clenched, his hands trembling with barely suppressed emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged fractured, as though the words themselves caused him physical pain. He cannot understand what it was like watching my brother deteriorate day by day. Edmund Carsworth did not merely ruin a business venture. He orchestrated a deliberate, systematic destruction of everything my brother had built. He manipulated financial markets, bribed local officials, and ensured that my brother would be unable to secure employment anywhere in England. The man was a predator, Poirot. A predator who moved through society with impunity because wealth granted him immunity from moral consequence. This much I do not dispute, Poirot replied. Your brother's suffering was genuine, and Lord Carsworth's culpability in that suffering was considerable. Yet your actions extend beyond mere retribution for past wrongs. You deliberately chose to involve Mr. Fairfax in this crime, a man whose embezzlement would not have been discovered had Lord Carsworth not possessed moral scruples regarding financial matters. You selected as your instrument of murder someone whose guilt was predetermined, whose capture would satisfy public demand for justice while concealing your own involvement. Blackwell's silence was answer enough. Poirot rose and moved toward the fireplace where the ashes of the Christmas Carol Code still smouldered faintly. But there is something far more troubling beneath the surface of your vengeance, Inspector. You did not merely wish to kill Lord Carsworth, you wished to destroy his reputation posthumously. The evidence you sought to conceal was not merely documentation of his crimes against your brother, but rather evidence of his attempted redemption. On Christmas Eve, facing mortality and moral reckoning, Lord Carsworth began to transform himself. He intended to make restitution, to acknowledge his past wrongs publicly and privately. I did not know this, Blackwell protested, his voice rising with the desperation of a man watching his justifications crumble. I knew only that he was a monster who deserved to die. Precisely, Poirot said quietly. This is the true tragedy underlying this entire affair. Your vengeance was constructed upon an incomplete understanding of your victim's character. You perceived Lord Carsworth as irredeemable because you required him to be irredeemable. Had you discovered evidence of his remorse, of his genuine intention to transform himself, your entire psychological framework, the justification for 2 decades of planning, would have collapsed entirely. Lady Carsworth made a small sound of comprehension from her chair. Poirot turned to acknowledge her understanding with a subtle nod. Your destruction of the parchment was not merely maternal protection of your son, though that motivation was present. It was also, whether consciously or unconsciously, the preservation of a narrative. The Christmas Carol Code represented evidence that Edmund Carsworth, for all his considerable sins, possessed capacity for moral evolution. This evidence was intolerable to those who required him to remain villainous. Blackwell's face contorted with the violence of emotions no longer capable of restraint. He deserved what he received. Whatever redemption he imagined for himself, it does not erase the reality of what he had done. My brother is dead because of Edmund Carsworth's actions. No last-minute conversion absolves him of that responsibility. No, Poirot agreed, his tone carrying unexpected gentleness. Redemption does not erase past wrongs, yet the pursuit of redemption, genuine and costly, possesses moral weight. Lord Carsworth had begun that pursuit, you murdered him precisely at the moment when transformation was becoming possible. In doing so, you did not merely kill a man, you killed the possibility of justice tempered with mercy, of wrongdoing acknowledged and restitution made. You chose vengeance over redemption, and in that choice, you became far more monstrous than the man you sought to destroy. Inspector Blackwell's composure shattered entirely. He lunged from his chair with the desperation of a caged animal recognizing the inevitability of its capture. Yet Poirot, anticipating such a response with the prescience born of decades observing human nature under duress, had positioned himself strategically near the drawing room's entrance. The constables moved with coordinated efficiency, intercepting Blackwell before he could reach the corridor leading toward the manor's rear exits. You cannot prove any of this, Blackwell spat, his voice emerging as a vicious snarl. The parchment is destroyed. Fairfax will corroborate my account of events. I am a decorated officer of Scotland Yard, my word against yours, the word of a foreign detective meddling in matters beyond his jurisdiction. Poirot smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had anticipated this precise objection. He withdrew a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket. its pages filled with a meticulous handwriting in his characteristic style. You are correct that the parchment has been destroyed. However, before Lady Carsworth enacted her dramatic gesture of maternal protection, I had committed the entire musical notation to memory. More significantly, I had already begun to decode its message. He opened the notebook, revealing a transcription of the Christmas Carol code alongside its musical translation. The fragments were indeed from various carols: God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, Silent Night, Joy to the World, but not arranged randomly as you suggested. Lord Carsworth deliberately interspersed these carols with biblical passages concerning forgiveness and redemption. When played in sequence, the melody itself forms a mnemonic device, a memory aid for those passages he wished to remember as he contemplated his final days. This proves nothing but Blackwater protested, yet his voice had lost its earlier conviction. He knew, with the terrible certainty of a man watching his elaborate construction collapse, that Poirot possessed evidence far more damaging than the parchment alone. On the contrary, Poirot replied, it proves that Lord Carsworth created the code with the found express purpose of documenting his state of mind during the hours preceding his murder. The passages he selected, all concerning forgiveness of wrongs, redemption through acknowledgement of sin, the possibility of transformation even in the face of past evil, these were his final testament to himself and to the world. You murdered him precisely as he was beginning to enact the very transformation that might have provided genuine restitution to those he had wronged. Poirot turned toward the constables, maintaining their grip upon Blackwell. However, the musical notation alone, while revealing Lord Carsworth's psychological state, would not constitute definitive proof of Inspector Blackwell's guilt in a court of law. Fortunately, there is additional evidence that he does not yet appreciate has been secured. At this precise moment, the manor's front door opened to admit Thomas Wickham, his head wound, wrapped in fresh bandages, yet his eyes burning with purpose. Behind him entered a younger man bearing a striking resemblance to the gardener, Wickham's grandson, whom Poirot had dispatched to the village hours earlier with specific instruction. The electrical system, Poirot explained, was restored approximately 20 minutes following its failure. During that interval, Inspector Blackwell believed himself concealed from observation, yet the young Mr. Wickham installed a device of considerable ingenuity, a phonograph mechanism hidden within the library's ventilation system. Everything spoken within that chamber during Blackwell's attempt to destroy the remaining evidence has been recorded in exquisite detail. Blackwell's final vestiges of composure disintegrated entirely. He began to struggle against the constables with renewed ferocity, his resistance born of the terrible knowledge that his carefully constructed deception had been utterly penetrated. The recordings would document his conversation with Fairfax, his explicit instructions regarding the murder's orchestration, his systematic destruction of documentary evidence. You will face a trial, Poirot had stated with absolute finality, not merely for the complicity in Lord Edmund Carsworth's murder, but for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and the attempted murder of Thomas Wickham. The courts will determine whether your 2 decades of plotting, your perversion of your official position, and your deliberate selection of an innocent man's reputation for destruction constitutes merely criminal conspiracy or something approaching the very crimes you claim to be avenging. As the constables secured Blackwell into restraints, leading him from the drawing room toward temporary detention, pending formal arrest procedures, Poirot retrieved the notebook, containing his transcription of the Christmas Carol code. He regarded its pages with the solemnity of a priest contemplating scripture, a meditation upon the terrible human capacity for both evil and the possibility of redemption, and the tragic consequences when one man's vengeance prevents another's transformation. The drawing room settled into an exhausted smile as the constables escorted Inspector Blackwell toward the manor's holding quarters, yet Poirot remained motionless, his small frame silhouetted against the fireplace, his expression suggesting that the investigation had not yet reached its true conclusion. Lady Carsworth, observing the detective's contemplative stillness, felt a renewed chill traverse her spine. "There is something troubling you," she stated, her voice carrying the perceptiveness of someone accustomed to reading subtle expressions. "You have secured the murderer and his accomplice, yet you seem dissatisfied." Poirot turned slowly to regard her with an intensity that made her previous discomfort pale in comparison. "Your destruction of the parchment was performed with admirable efficiency, madame. Yet it was accomplished with such swiftness, such decisive purpose, that one might reasonably inquire whether you acted upon impulse or upon premeditation. You knew, did you not, that Inspector Blackwell possessed involvement in Lord Carsworth's death long before this evening's revelations? Lady Carsworth's carefully maintained composure began to fissure. She rose from her chair with the grace that had characterized all her movements, yet her hands betrayed the trembling she could no longer conceal. I suspected nothing of the sort. I acted solely to protect my son from exposure of his financial improprieties. An admirable motivation, Poirot acknowledged, yet insufficient to explain your actions. You see, madame, I have examined the household accounts with meticulous care. 3 months ago, approximately the time when Inspector Blackwell claimed to have arrived at Thornfield Manor for the first time, a sum of considerable magnitude was transferred from Lord Carsworth's personal accounts to an external entity. The recipient was obscured through several layers of financial intermediaries, yet the trail, when followed with sufficient persistence, leads directly to an investment account bearing your name. Lady Carsworth's silence proved more eloquent than any verbal protestation could have achieved. Poirot moved toward her with the measured precision of a predator approaching wounded prey. You were being blackmailed, were you not? Not merely regarding your romantic indiscretion, but regarding something far more serious. Something that involved your son directly and extended back considerably further than the recent gambling debts and financial entanglements. You cannot prove, Lady Carsworth began, but Poirot raised his hand to silence her. I can and I shall. You see, when I examined the records of Julian's activities in London, I discovered that his gambling did not commence merely months ago. It began 4 years prior, shortly after a young woman, the daughter of one of Lord Carsworth's business associates, died under circumstances officially ruled as accidental, but widely suspected as suicide. Julian was present during the events immediately preceding her death. In fact, according to testimony provided to the local authorities at the time, your son was the last person to see the young woman alive. Julian's face went deathly pale. He began to rise from his chair, but Poirot continued without acknowledging his distress. Lord Carsworth, possessing his characteristic capacity for ruthless investigation, discovered evidence suggesting that your son bore considerable responsibility for the young woman's death, not through direct action, but through a deliberate and calculated campaign of emotional manipulation that ultimately resulted in her self-destruction. The young woman left a letter specifically naming Julian as the cause of her despair. This is preposterous, as Julian protested, his voice emerging as barely a whisper. I did it not. You seduced her, abandoned her when she proved inconvenient, then systematically destroyed her reputation through deliberate dissemination of false information regarding her character and comportment, Poirot stated with cold precision. She took her own life not because of romantic disappointment, but because the shame and social ostracism you engineered made existence itself unbearable. Lady Carsworth sank back into her chair, her carefully constructed facade crumbling entirely. Edmund discovered Julian's involvement 4 months ago. He demanded that I convince my son to turn himself over to the authorities, that he submit to criminal investigation and potential prosecution for his role in the young woman's death. I refused categorically. I paid Inspector Blackwell to ensure that any investigation would be suppressed, that the case would remain officially closed. Poirot's expression remained coldly analytical. And when Lord Carsworth refused to be dissuaded by financial incentives, when he began drafting the Christmas Carol Code as a record of his intention to expose both Julian's spouse, crime and your conspiracy to conceal it, you contacted Inspector Blackwell and arranged for your husband's murder. You did not merely wish to prevent exposure, you wished to eliminate the man who possessed the moral courage to demand accountability from those he loved. The manor fell into a profound silence. The Christmas Carol Code, Poirot realized, had been not merely Lord Carsworth's attempt at redemption regarding his own past crimes, but a desperate final act of accountability. Father attempting to force his son to face the consequences of moral evil, even at the cost of family destruction. Poirot regarded Lady Carsworth with an expression of profound melancholy, as though observing the final dissolution of human dignity under the weight of accumulated moral failure. You see, madame, the tragedy of this entire affair is that you attempted to protect your son from accountability by ensuring that accountability would be transformed into something far more terrible, murder, conspiracy. The deliberate obstruction of terms of justice. In saving Julian from prosecution for one crime, you ensured his complicity in a far greater one. Lady Carsworth rose unsteadily from her chair, her body seeming to age decades within moments. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice stripped of all pretense, reduced to the raw vulnerability of a mother confronting the consequences of her choices. "That," Poirot replied, "is a question for the legal authorities to determine. My function was to reveal the truth, which I have now accomplished with perhaps greater completeness than was initially anticipated. Inspector Blackwell murdered Lord Edmund Carsworth at your behest, madame. You provided the financial incentive, the knowledge regarding your husband's intentions, and the assurance that official investigation would be suppressed. Your son, while bearing no direct responsibility for his father's death, benefited considerably from the crime and possessed knowledge of the conspiracy beforehand." Julian began to speak, but Poirot silenced him with a gesture of consummate authority. "Do not insult my intelligence with protestations of innocence. The hotel clerk in London testified that you met with Inspector Blackwell on no fewer than 7 occasions during the months preceding Christmas. The financial transfers from your mother's account to Blackwell's intermediaries coincide precisely with these meetings. You knew. Perhaps you attempted to convince yourself that your knowledge was merely theoretical, that you possessed no direct involvement in your father's death. Such self-deception is a luxury you may no longer afford." The constables who had remained in the drawing room moved forward with quiet purpose, securing both Lady Carsworth and Julian in restraints. Yet Poirot raised his hand once more, commanding a final moment of attention before they were removed from the room. "I wish you to understand precisely what has occurred here," he addressed the assembled group. Lord Edmund Carsworth was a man of considerable moral complexity. He had perpetrated genuine wrongs, financial ruin of competitors, sexual exploitation of vulnerable young women, the cultivation of an environment wherein moral accountability was systematically undermined by wealth and social position. Yet in his final days, confronting mortality and the accumulated weight of his transgressions, he initiated the process of genuine transformation. He created the Christmas Carol Code not as a puzzle for detectives, but as a meditation upon redemption and the possibility of change, even for those whose lives have been marked by profound evil. Poirot moved to the pianoforte once more, his fingers touching the keys without actually depressing them. Inspector Blackwell murdered him not merely as retribution for past wrongs, but because the prospect of Carsworth's redemption rendered the narrative of pure vengeance untenable. You see, Inspector Blackwell required Lord Carsworth to remain villainous, irredeemable, deserving of death. The moment genuine remorse became evident, the moral justification for murder collapsed entirely. Yet rather than accept this collapse, Blackwell chose to commit murder anyway, and in doing so he became far more culpable than the man he sought to punish. He turned toward Thomas Wickham, who had remained subdued throughout these final revelations. "Your grandson's ingenuity in concealing the phonograph mechanism has proven invaluable, monsieur. The recordings will provide irrefutable documentation of Inspector Blackwell's conspiracy. Justice, while imperfect, will be served through conventional legal channels." As the constables led Lady Carsworth and Julian from the drawing room, Poirot settled himself before the fire, his expression contemplative. The Christmas Carol Code had been ultimately decoded, not as a message of guilt or innocence, but as a profound meditation upon the human capacity for both moral failure and the possibility of transformation. Lord Edmund Carsworth had been murdered at the precise moment when such transformation was becoming genuine, leaving behind only the melancholy certainty that redemption, once interrupted by a double wildly can never truly be complete. The manor fell silent except for the crackling of the fire, and Hercule Poirot sat motionless, pondering the terrible cost of vengeance pursued beyond the point where justice might have transformed into mercy. The morning following the arrests dawned grey and cold over Thornfield Manor, the sun struggling to penetrate the lingering clouds that had characterised the entire investigation. Poirot prepared to depart, his modest luggage packed with the same meticulous precision he applied to matters of criminal investigation. Inspector Blackwell's replacement, a younger man named Detective Sergeant Collins, awaited him in the entrance hall to offer formal thanks and arrange transport to the railway station. Yet before Poirot could complete his departure, Thomas Wickham approached him with a hesitance that suggested the gardener possessed knowledge he had long deliberated whether to share. Poirot, perceptive as always, recognised this reluctance and gestured for the elderly man to accompany him to the library, that room which had witnessed so much tragedy and a revelation. "You have something to tell me," Poirot observed, settling into the chair that had become his headquarters throughout the investigation. "Something that you have withheld from the authorities and from my own inquiries. I wonder what could possess a man of your demonstrated integrity to maintain secret regarding information pertinent to a murder investigation." Wickham moved toward the bookshelf where Poirot had originally observed the suspicious gap. He withdrew a slim volume bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age, its spine bearing the marks of frequent consultation. "This was the book that Lord Carsworth was reading on Christmas Eve," Wickham explained, his voice barely audible. "The one whose absence from the shelf initially suggested to you that something had been disturbed. When I discovered it fallen behind the radiator during my cleaning duties on the morning after the murder, I thought perhaps it contained evidence that might complicate matters further." Poirot accepted the volume with careful attention. It was a collection of philosophical essays, its margins dense with our handwritten annotations in Lord Carsworth's precise script. Yet what arrested Poirot's attention was a pressed envelope tucked between the final pages, addressed in Carsworth's hand to "the detective who solves my murder." "You read this letter?" Poirot inquired, his tone suggesting that the question was rhetorical. "I could not resist," Wickham admitted, his shame evident in every syllable. "Lord Carsworth wrote to you directly, Monsieur Poirot. He anticipated his own death. He knew that someone intended to kill him, and he prepared this document as a final testament, not merely regarding his own crimes, but regarding matters that extend far beyond what has been disclosed during this investigation." Poirot opened the envelope with deliberate care, withdrawing several pages of dense handwriting. His expression remained inscrutable as he read, yet occasionally his dark eyes widened fractionally, a subtle indication of surprise that few observers would have detected. When he had finished reading, he remained motionless for several moments, the letter resting upon his lap. "There is another crime," Poirot stated quietly, not as a question but as confirmation. "Another death, similarly orchestrated, similarly concealed beneath layers of deception and official negligence. This is what Lord Carsworth discovered in his final months. Not merely evidence of his son's culpability in one young woman's death, but awareness of a pattern extending across years and potentially involving multiple victims." Wickham nodded miserably. "He wrote of a conspiracy, a network of individuals bound together through mutual complicity in crimes ranging from embezzlement to worse, far worse. He believed that Inspector Blackwell's involvement was merely the surface manifestation of something more extensive. He attempted to document everything in this letter, but he ran out of time. The Christmas Carol code was meant to be supplementary, a secondary message encoding the essential details should the letter itself be lost or destroyed. Poirot folded the letter with meticulous care, returning it to its envelope. "You should have reported this to the authorities immediately." "I know," Wickham replied, his voice thick with regret. "But Lord Carsworth wrote that he trusted only you to investigate these matters fully, that the corruption extended into places where conventional investigation would be suppressed. He feared that by disclosing this information to local authorities, I would only ensure the destruction of evidence and the protection of those responsible for multiple crimes." As Poirot prepared to depart Thornfield Manor an hour later, his mind was already engaged with the implications of Carsworth's final letter. The Christmas Carol code, which he had believed to represent a simple meditation upon redemption, now appeared to be something far more complex, a musical cipher encoding the names and crimes of individuals whose influence extended across the very institutions tasked with investigating criminal activity. The railway platform was deserted save for a solitary figure whose face Poirot could not quite discern through the morning mist. Yet as his train pulled away from the station, he noticed this mysterious observer watching his departure with an intensity that suggested considerably more than casual interest. The mystery of Thornfield Manor had been resolved certainly, yet Poirot recognised with absolute certainty that its resolution represented not a conclusion, but rather the beginning of an investigation far more profound and dangerous than anything he had previously encountered.